What's going on, GOAT Format Duelists? I want to give you all a quick, easy tip for deck building in GOAT format. So this is a deck building tactic that I've discovered kind of after trial and error, but I think is very helpful if you're trying to optimize your GOAT format deck building. Welcome to GOAT Duels. I'm ACP. Now let's dive in. So what is this tactic that I'm talking about? Well, I actually don't really have a name for it, but if you guys want to come up with a name for it, feel free to suggest one in the comments. But the issue stems from really, I think in GOAT format to a large extent, like ratios are important. Certain ratios are important. This was an issue that I found with fitting light monsters into chaos decks. I think it can be applied to other potential deck building problems as well. I think it can even be applied beyond GOAT format. But a while back, I was playing this deck, just chaos control here. I don't have the whole list. I'm just trying to emphasize the key cards here. And while I was building this deck, and playing this deck, by the way, I sort of found that I had issues with light monsters. So what I found is kind of as a general rule of thumb in GOAT format, if you have one chaos monster, you need 4 lights, 4 darks. If you have 2, you probably need 5 lights, 5 darks. And then if you have 3, I find that you need 6. Now, if we're building this sort of style of deck, we're going for Thunder Dragon, right? We're going to play that as 3 of our lights, and then, okay, we need 3 more. And generally, the 2 Magician of Faith is standard. And that's kind of the question of, how are we going to find the 6th? Yes, you could play 3 Magician of Faith, but then you run the risk of running into Nobleman of Crossout. You could play something else, something that's a little more situational. It used to be the case, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, you used to see these decks play, 1 Azura Priest as, their 6th light monster. For a while, that was kind of standard. And then people sort of stopped. Through trial and error, I was experimenting with different light options, trying to figure out, okay, what is, the 6th light monster that I want? And really, by the way, just kind of as a quick aside, all of this stuff that I learned about GOAT format and I share with you all, I figure all this out through trial and error. I know some people try to come up with quote unquote theories oh, I've used my logic and wisdom to find the optimal deck building technique. For me, I kind of do the opposite. I test a lot of stuff, figure out what works, and then try to come up with a theory to explain it later. So that's sort of what I'm doing here. But yeah, I tried different options, and then what I tried is I tried a different approach entirely. And I said, sort of the conundrum was, I noticed, you'll see here, these 4 light monsters, they're kind of all okay versus certain specific matchups, but they're not, generically good. Azura Priest is really good against the decks that have Scapegoat, but, not that amazing against anything else. Blade Knight is really good against the Chaos decks that play a bunch of flips, but, not really good against anything else. Roulette Barrel is good against aggro, and not good against anything else. And Hysteric Fairy is good against burn, but not good against anything else. So it was okay, we want one of these cards to be our 6th light monster. How can we really choose one, right? How can we choose one? And what I decided, what I found out through playtesting is we actually don't have to choose. What you can actually do is just have one of each of these cards in your side deck and just say, okay, in game 1, I'm going to have a slightly suboptimal list with not really the ratio that I want, but then in game 2 and 3 I'm gonna fix it. So in game 1 we're gonna have 5 lights versus the GOAT control type decks. Azura is our 6th light versus the standard chaos decks. Blade Knight is the 6th light versus Warriors. Roulette Barrel is the 6th light, and then versus burn, Hysteric Fairy is the 6th light. So realize that in general, in any card game that's 2 out of 3, whether it's GOAT format, Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic, whatever, about 60% of your games are going to be post-side, and then 40% are going to be game 1s. The reason is, about half the time you're going to go to a game 3, right? Because if we assume that the person who wins game 1 has about a 50% chance to win game 2, then that means half the time we're going to have a game 3. So you're going to have 1.5 post-board games on average, and obviously 1 pre-side game on average. So that comes out to 40% of the time you're playing game ones, 60% of the time you're playing post side. So the idea is like, okay, 40% of the time our deck is going to be, slightly suboptimal, which is fine, but then 60% of the time we get to fix it, and we get to fix it with a card that we know is good in the matchup, as opposed to saying, okay, I'm just going to main deck Blade Knight for game one and then have to side it out a lot. Like, yes, you could do that, and people have tried doing that sort of thing, but then the issue is like, okay, 40% of the time, yes, your chaos ratios are a little better, but you're including this card that just isn't very good versus like half the meta. Which in a deck like Chaos Control that already runs into some consistency issues, having to play this sort of Blade Knight as a tech card or the Azura Priest as a tech card, it runs the risk of making your deck even more consistent. So basically what I'm saying is, whether you're playing like 5 lights or 6 lights, you're going to have a consistency issue either way. So it's just kind of a question of, pick your poison. Like, either way, the deck isn't going to be quote-unquote optimal in game one. So it's like, okay, well, how do I want it to not be optimal? And again, from, testing over the course of really years, this is what I found to be the best way to solve that problem. And it was extremely counterintuitive for, the first 5 years or whatever that I was playing GOAT format. It never occurred to me to do this, which is why I wanted to tell you all about this as an option. Because I think to most players, it doesn't even occur to them that you could do something like this as, as a way to fine tune your ratios. And additionally, one thing that I want to mention too is like, if you're playing Chaos, obviously one of the cards you're concerned about is Kaiku, right? But obviously you're going to be seeing more Kaikus post-side than you will in game one, because you do have some decks that either don't main Kaiku but side it in, or you have some decks, like occasionally, I know we saw one Chaos deck where it like made one Kaiku and then sided the second. So the idea here is like, okay, in game one we're going to have fewer lights, but we're also going to see fewer Kaikus in game one. So like missing that light isn't as big of a deal in game one as it is post-board. So that's kind of the other layer of the argument that I wanted to add on. And I'll give you another example, because I think it's good to have multiple examples. With Monarchs, I kind of ran into a very similar kind of issue. Now, in Monarchs, it's different because here, this was like a Stein Monarch deck. Again, I'm not showing you the whole deck, because I'm just trying to like concentrate on the important cards here. You'll notice like even the Monarch video that I posted, I don't know what it was, like a year back, where I was talking about Stein Monarchs and how it won so many games for me and so on. So that deck list, it had 2 Zaborgs, 2 Mobius, and 2 Magician of Faith. So we were doing a 50-50 split on the Monarchs. We were running BLS, and then the idea was like, okay, again, if I'm playing my 1 Chaos Monster, I want to have at least 4 lights for it. So we put in the 2 Magician of Faiths. And with this kind of Cold Wave Stein anti-meta flavor of Monarchs, what I noticed, and what other people have noticed too, is that Magician of Faith isn't super strong in this deck. It has some issues. Now, obviously, yes, there are the scenarios where, like, you set your Magician of Faith, next turn you flip it face up, get back a spell, tribute for Monarch, go +1. Yes, you can do that, but in this kind of Monarch list, you aren't running a lot of ways to protect your flips, so that play isn't going to happen as often as it would in, like, a more classic sort of, like, Soul Control style Monarch list. So Faith wasn't that good. Like, you're not going +1 with it super often. There weren't, like, a ton of great spells to get back either. Like, okay, you could get back a Trinity piece. You can get back a Brain Control, whatever it may be. But it's not like you have tons of super juicy targets the way that you do in, like, a Chaos deck or a Goat Control deck. And yes, even though, like, sure, you contribute it for Monarch, you don't have tons of synergy with Tsukiyomi or anything like that. So, and what this anti-meta flavor of Monarch was really trying to do is put pressure on the opponent. And, like, Faith doesn't really do that a whole lot. So, you know, I know people like Alefiatu also noticed Faith, like, it's okay, but, like, it doesn't really have a ton of synergy with the deck. It's not really what the deck wants to be doing. But because BLS is so good in general, you feel like, well, I have to play it because I need the lights for my BLS. When I was sort of, as I've been going back, trying to improve the Monarch deck from the past, I was trying to think like, okay, is there any way that I can just not play Magician of Faith? Because I don't think Faith is good in like an anti-meta style Monarch list. Now, what I found is I was like, okay, I could play 3 Zaborg because Zaborg is really good in the current meta. Could change at some point, but it's really good right now. Very good against the Chaos decks, and even like reasonably strong against Goat Control. It's not like the nuts against Goat Control, but it's fine. So I was like, okay, we can just play like 3 Zaborgs. Well, that's 3 of our lights. We were already playing DD Warrior Lady, because that's like a pretty strong, aggressive option. That's kind of like a half a light, in a way. I always say that DD Warrior Lady, it's like playing half a light monster, because half the time it ends up in the grave, half the time it gets banished, roughly speaking. So we've got 3.5 lights to support our BLS. And that's like the question of like, well, we want to have at least 4, and we don't really have 4. So what's the 4th light going to be? Now, again, I know like Alefiatu, he tried Reflect Bounder, said, oh yeah, Reflect Bounder sucked, I would never play it again. So it's like, okay, what's the 4th light? Do we want it, since we kind of like going aggressive? Do we want to play Blade Knight? Do we want to play Azura? Well, I mean, we could, but again, you run into that issue of, okay, now you're playing this kind of situational light monster that doesn't necessarily have a ton of synergy with our strategy. So I don't think main decking Blade Knight in Monarchs is really any better than main decking Magician of Faith. It's still the same sort of problem, just a different version of it. But again, what I found is that what you can actually do is you can just say, screw it, for game 1, I'm going to get a little greedy on my light count. I'm going to play BLS with my 3 Zaborg, 1 DD Warrior Lady, and hope that's good enough. And then the idea is, well, how am I going to fix it post-side? Well, the strategy is, again, versus Goat Control, we bring in Azura Priest. That becomes our 4th light. Versus the standard Chaos deck, we bring in Blade Knight. That becomes our 4th light. And then, versus Warriors, or just kind of aggro decks in general, but mainly Warriors, okay, what's going to be our 4th light against Warriors? Now, we could do what we did with the last deck, which is go, oh, we'll just side in Roulette Barrel. 2,000 defense, that card is fine versus Warriors. And, I mean, that's not wrong, right? That's certainly not wrong. Roulette Barrel is pretty strong against Warriors. However, with this deck, we run into another issue, which is that Zaborg is absolute trash against Warriors. Just because of the fact that it's very hard to get value out of Zaborg, in the sense that you have to have a monster to tribute for Zaborg. Of course, if you like brain control the monster tribute for Zaborg, well, that only works if they have 2 monsters. Sometimes they will. But versus Warriors, Mobius is way better than Zaborg, because Warriors are setting a lot of, Dust Tornado, Sakuretsu Armor, that sort of thing. So rather than blowing up their monster with Zaborg, it's better to blow up their back row with Mobius and then attack over their monster, because pretty much all their monsters are less than 2,400, other than, well, their own BLS, of course. Really, against Warriors, you should be looking out to side your Zaborgs. At that point, if we're trying to leave in our BLS versus Warriors, we're not talking about finding a 4th light. We're talking about finding a 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th light, right? If we're siding out all of our Zaborgs. So what I decided versus Warriors instead is that rather than trying to keep in BLS versus Warriors, we actually take out the Zaborg versus Warriors, take out BLS, bring in Mobius, and then just, don't have any Chaos monsters at all. And since the Warrior decks normally will keep in their Kaikus for us, this strategy actually accomplishes a lot of things. 1, it gets Zaborg out of our deck, which isn't very good against Warriors. We replace it with Mobius, which is really good versus Warriors. And we take out BLS and make their Kaiku worse. So doing this siding strategy versus Warriors, you basically win on 3 fronts. So again, I found this to be a pretty good strategy in the current meta. It's basically the same thing that we were doing before with the Chaos deck. In the case of the Monarch deck, what we do is, if we keep BLS in post-side, we bring in either the Azura or the Blade Knight. If we decide that we don't want to do that, and then we just take out the B list entirely. So in either case, you basically solve your problem versus the top 3 decks in the meta. So yeah, I don't necessarily know what to call this side decking strategy. I mean, it's basically the general strategy is in game 1, you get a little greedy on your ratios with the intent of fixing it post side. So I don't know what to call that. That's like a lot of words, like greedy game 1, fix it post side. I don't know if that's what we're going to call it. But I've just found this to be very helpful. I know this is a little different from like the usual content, but I think it's something that can truly help players that are trying to fix their deck building problems in GOAT format. So yeah, let me know in the comments if maybe you're already doing this. And if you are, let me know how it's working for you. Because in the case of the Chaos deck and the Monarch deck, doing this strategy with the ratios and fixing them post side, it has worked well for me. Thanks for watching and take care.